You're reading the Bible and a verse sticks out to you, so you want to verse map it. Verse mapping is a system of digging deep into a particular verse of the Bible and studying it in depth. But it's a tricky skill that you have to learn and practice. So today, let's verse map together and practice these Bible study skills that are so important for exegesis and application of the Bible to our life. Let's begin. Welcome back to the channel. This week, I just have to say, this is a totally personal note, but this week has been quite the week in the Womack household. We had sickness, allergic reactions. I think someone's coming down with the ear infection. It has been a chaotic week. And so I just wasn't going to post any video at all. I did have, however, a video that will come in the coming weeks of verse mapping and tips, tricks, verse map real time together. And so I didn't want to wait another week though to get a verse mapping video out to you guys because this is so highly requested. Verse mapping is such an important Bible study skill. Y'all guys ask me all the time for tips, tricks, how, let's do it together, all that kind of stuff. And so I said, you know what? I have literal years of verse mapping studies on my Patreon. Let me grab one of those, cut it down, and share it here on YouTube. If you guys don't know, Patreon is a crowdfunding website to support creators like me, musicians, artists, and then like silly little YouTubers, where you get extra, exclusive, or more in-depth content behind a paywall. And that paywall goes to support that creator to make more good content like that. So this video is very literally sponsored by my Patreons. I love you guys. Y'all are the best. But really every single video here on my YouTube, TikTok, Instagram, all of them are truly sponsored by my Patreons. If you are interested in more in-depth studies like what you're about to watch, consider joining Patreon. If you join the top tier before the 15th of each month, I will mail you these Bible journaling stickers. They have like word studies on them from the Greek and the Hebrew. So if you want to join Patreon, I'll have it linked down below. But thank you so much to my Patreons that make content like this happen, truly. But let's get into our study. Today we're looking at James 1-2. This is actually a part of a James verse mapping through the entire book of James. It was a study that we did on my Patreon. So again, if you join today, you could get that access. Even though we did it almost a year ago, you can go through the whole study with me. And there is a worksheet to guide you through a verse mapping. So I'll verse map through this video, and it's really super helpful if you print off the worksheet and fill it out as we go through this study of James 1-2. But I pray that it blesses you. And without further ado, let's get into the study. Hi friends, today we are doing a verse mapping study on James 1-2. So if y'all will look at the bottom is an attachment. Download, print this off. This is a basic verse mapping kind of map that I like to follow. The bubbles make sense for my brain. You'll see our main core verse right here, and then we'll kind of address all of these topics around it. Some weeks will be 2 pages, other weeks maybe it will even get to 3 pages. But my goal here in verse mapping with y'all weekly is to always grow our overall Bible study skills. I typically give us 3 steps to follow when we're verse mapping. And if you don't know what verse mapping is studying one particular verse in depth, really looking at it and studying it kind of closer. I like to do this whenever a verse jumps off the page or a verse just really sticks out to me or even confuses me. So with verse mapping, I like to first look at context. Context is very important because if we just take one verse out of context and look at it, it might mean something completely different than what it was originally intended to mean. A really easy example of this is Philippians 4:13, which taken out of context at first glance, I can do all things through Christ who gives me strength, can seem very empowering and encouraging, and that's wonderful. But when we look at it in context, it actually means so much more. It's so much more rich because he's saying, even despite the worst trials and the worst persecution, I can endure because Christ is empowering, providing for me. And that's so rich. And it really takes our biblical knowledge, our understanding of Philippians 4, all of that to a deeper level. And so if you're here, if you like my Bible study content, y'all know we don't want to take verses out of context because we see the value and the richness in looking at the context and looking more in depth. And so that's my heart with verse mapping, is to first start with context because it does enhance our overall Bible knowledge so much. Secondly, we look at translations. Translations are tools, not something to be feared. In particular, like the top 10-ish most popular translations, they are tools for our use. Some will deliver the thought a lot better than others, while others might be a little bit more faithful to the original words. But because they're so faithful to the original words, we might misunderstand them, and then we need the thought for thought translations. And so I talk about translations and the spectrum of translations a lot. I have a whole playlist on my YouTube channel called Which Translation Should You Use, I think. But that's not our discussion today. Our second step though is translations. Now our third step is to go word by word. That's where we have a lot of fun with word studies, and we look at the Greek or the Hebrew, and we really dig a little bit deeper about why is this wording here? What is the phraseology? What was the original intent based off of the context? And all of this is to grow us in our knowledge so that our walk will display a greater faith in the Lord. You know, we can do these in-depth intellectual studies, but if it doesn't affect the way we live, then we're kind of falling short. And so I thought this would be the perfect book to start with, to study such a wisdom-rich book as James. If you guys don't know, James is like what I fondly refer to as the wisdom literature of the New Testament. I remember one of my professors, I think in seminary, referred to it that way, and I thought it was so peculiar. And the more I thought about it, the more I was like, this is really the wisdom literature of the New Testament. It's so wise, it's so convicting, it's very pithy, where like every little verse almost could be a different convicting, life-changing statement. But what's so beautiful about it is in the New Testament, so it's written after the cross. And so let me address a little bit about the author, who it was written to, etc. Now, James wrote the book of James. James is the half-brother of Jesus. So he was Mary and Joseph's son. Now we say half-brother because Jesus was conceived by the Holy Spirit, not a blood son to Joseph. So James and Joseph would have been bunkmates. They would have shared toys. They would have, eaten at the dinner table together, done chores together, etc. In Mark 3:21 and other references, we get a really good idea that James was not one who believed in Jesus. He was not one that supported that Jesus could have truly been the Messiah. And yet we know after the resurrection, he did believe. He did come to a saving knowledge, okay, this really isn't just a brother that's, whatever. He really is the Messiah. And so James became a leader in the early church. We even see him recorded being there at Acts 15, the big Jerusalem council, when they were making the decisions about like the Jews and the Gentiles and how to be a combined church. So he was a big leader in the church, but obviously he came from a very strong Jewish background. And so this letter, this book of James, is written to the church at large. It literally says in verse 1, to the 12 tribes in the dispersion, the 12 tribes of Israel dispersed. He's writing to believers. This doesn't exclude Gentiles, but Gentiles, remember, are grafted into the family of the faith. And he's writing to them in a very Jewish way. This is very Jewish language, culture. Even the way that he writes is very good Greek. But like I said, there's no clear structure because it is so like pithy wisdom. You know how like Proverbs, like every verse is a different topic, sometimes 2 topics in a verse. It's the same way here almost. A little less so, but he is moving around a lot. However, amidst this whole book, we can see 2 main focuses that James continually keeps coming back to. He keeps his thoughts keep returning back to 2 main topics, and that is persecution and favoritism in the church. This is said to be written probably sometime before the fall of Jerusalem in 70 AD. So really right after the ascension, sometime in those first early centuries where persecution started ramping up in like the 60s. So probably around that era under Nero. And he really does focus on the fact that we're going to face trials like we'll see later today in our study. And amidst that, one thing that never survives, never thrives in persecution is a cold, dead orthodoxy. And James really addresses that. Those who have been living under the law haven't really believed what they say they believe, even like what we would refer to as cultural Christians. This is where their faith is really tested, and they really have to ask themselves, do I really believe what I say I believe because I'm going to die for it? And on top of that, do I really believe what I say I believe because I need to treat my neighbor like I do? Because once again, a really common pattern that we see in the early church, it's addressed in nearly every single epistle. I think every single epistle, yeah. I'm trying to scan through them in my brain right now, but yeah, I would say every single epistle addresses the issue, the Jew-Gentile issue of like Jews were God's holy people and they ate a certain way and they lived a certain way, and you would expect them to receive the gospel, and yet they weren't necessarily as receptive to the gospel. Instead, the Gentiles were super receptive and they weren't eating a certain way. They weren't circumcised. They weren't perfect Jews by any means. So how do we welcome them into the faith? And then second of all, how do these two groups of people gather together and even have the Lord's Supper, because they have different cleanliness laws and eating rules. So this was a huge, big topic the first 100 years after the ascension, because they just didn't know how to do it. How do you do it? How do we find unison among people that are so different? And so partiality, dead orthodoxy, all of this is playing a role in it. And then finally, the most popular thing when we think about James is faith without works is dead. I personally don't love that language, faith without works is dead. It's been commonly popularized. I don't love that translation, or that summarization is what I would say. Translation less so. The summarization of that whole passage, which we'll get to in chapter 2, verses 14 and following. We'll get to that eventually, but I don't love that summary of that section, because that's not what the section is saying. If you boil it down to just faith without works is dead, you could argue then that if you don't have works, you're not saved, and therefore you're saved by works. And that is not what this section of James is saying. Rather, James is saying a faith that doesn't change the way that you live is dead. That's what James is saying. And if you just reread it, you'll see that. And so if I was to put my own chapter heading on that, that's what I would do. James is really arguing if we say we believe something and it doesn't change the way that we live, then we don't really believe it. Many people have argued in the past that James kind of contradicts Paul by saying, you know, faith without works is dead, so you are working unto your salvation. And Paul argues gross. And rather, what you see when you read both of them is they're both saying the same thing in different ways. I've visualized this before. I like to put the cross in the very center, and on one end we have fruit, and then on one end of the cross you have confession, repentance. So when we become a new believer, we confess, we repent, and we believe in Jesus Christ. And then we produce fruit, and our life is changed by that. So Paul talks from this end of the conversation. He says, first we are saved by grace and receive the life in the cross, and then we produce fruit. James really focuses on this end because he is talking to the church, and he's saying, remember though, we got to be producing fruit if we truly are saved over here. If we truly have repented, we should be producing fruit. Both of them are on the same process of the Christian life. They're not contradicting each other. They're both talking about different eras, different aspects of the Christian walk and the life being changed by Jesus Christ. That's an important aspect to also note. Some people really focus on Paul and like to ignore James, and other people like to really focus on James and ignore Paul because of this dichotomy, and it's really a misperceived dichotomy. There's really nothing there. They're both saying the same thing on the same topic, just with different words, different ways, and at different angles. All right, now let's get into today's reading. Let's start in verse 2 of chapter 1 in James. Verse 1 is really short. It's a really short greeting. He just jumps into the letter and he says, "Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds, for you know that the testing of your faith produces steadfastness." Circle steadfastness, maybe choose orange, and let steadfastness, circle it again, that's the same word, have its full effect, that you may be perfect and complete, lacking nothing. Steadfastness, this word we'll see pop up again in chapter 5. This is just a common theme in James' mind. Trials, even later down in verse 12, he's going to say perseverance. They produce a steadfastness or a perseverance. They help us in our walk unto the Lord, or our running, as Hebrews talks about in chapter 12. The Christian life isn't about it being easy. Rather, it's sanctifying because it's not easy. All right, let's keep going though. If any of you lacks wisdom, let him ask God, who gives generously to all without reproach, and it will be given to him. But let him ask in faith with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind. For that person must not suppose that he will receive anything from the Lord. He is double-minded, unstable in all his ways. Now, as you can see, we kind of get the vibes of wisdom literature, because he's kind of gone on a little bit of a rabbit trail here in verses 5 through 8. Here he's talking about asking the Lord for wisdom and asking the Lord for wisdom and faith. A little bit of a rabbit trail, but still perpendicular to the topic of our faith being tested through trials. Moving on to verse 9. Let the lowly brother boast in his exaltation, and the rich in his humiliation, because like a flower of the grass, he will pass away. Ooh, this reminds me of our Psalm studies we've been doing. In particular, Psalm 37, which I just posted, uses very similar plant imagery and comparison between the righteous and the wicked. For the sun rises with its scorching heat and withers the grass. Its flower falls and its beauty perishes. perishes, so also will the rich man fade away in the midst of his pursuits. Verse 12, blessed is the man who remains steadfast under trial, for when he has stood the test, he will receive the crown of life, which God has promised to those who love him. Let no one say he is tempted. I am being tempted by God, for God cannot be tempted with evil, and he himself tempts no one. But each person is tempted when he is lured and enticed by his own desire. Then desire, when it has conceived, gives birth to sin, and sin, when it is fully grown, brings forth death. Do not be deceived, my beloved brothers. Every good gift and every perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father of lights, with whom there is no variation or shadow due to change. Of his own will, he brought us forth by the word of truth, that we should be a kind of first fruits of his creatures. So again, we see another rabbit trail on God can't be tempted, but ultimately the main theme, the main message here in this section is trials are actually growing you, strengthening you, and they're a joy. They're actually to be viewed as positive, right? The world looks at wealth and comfort and prideful things. We are going to rest in the Lord and our secure riches in him, like verse 12 mentions. So if I'm to summarize this big section here, I would pick verse 2. Count it all joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. James isn't trying to act like we don't face trials. James doesn't try and act like trials are an exception or an oddball. He assumes that we're going to face trials, and not just trials, but trials of various kinds, whether it's financial or health or social or cultural or political, we're going to be facing trials. And he tells us to count it all joy. Now, y'all remember the first step of verse mapping this verse, and we have it here on the worksheet, is to start with context. Who is speaking to whom and why? And you guys might have already filled this blue circle in while I was talking, but go ahead and pause the video here and fill out who's talking to whom and why is he talking? What seems to be his heart or passion here as he is writing to the churches dispersed under persecution? And as the half-brother of Jesus, can we just note the fact that he opens this book saying, which I love by the way, he says, James, a servant of God and of the Lord Jesus Christ, a servant of his brother. He doesn't say, you know, the half-brother of Jesus, and that's why you should listen to me. He doesn't like elect himself to a certain prideful stance in front of the church. Instead, he just says, I'm the servant of the Lord and of my brother, of Jesus Christ. He doesn't say brother, but he's taking on this very humble attitude as he addresses the church in the midst of persecution. It's beautiful. All right, now y'all know step number 2 is to look at translations, and we actually have that laid out for you in this green circle. It says translations differ on this first phrase. And that's really basically the only place it super differs in the translations. And if you guys haven't been here and done verse mapping with me, you'll note that it's important to note that translations, whenever they differ on a phrase or on a word, whenever you see a lot of translations doing different things with a certain phrase or word, that's where you know you want to study the Greek or the Hebrew. That's when you know you should do a word study and figure out what the original languages were saying, because clearly our modern languages are having a hard time finding a one-for-one translation of that. So let's say, I mean, I'm trying to think of previous studies we've done, but we've done studies all over the Bible where, you know, one phrase can be translated at least 3 different ways in the KJV versus the NLT versus the ESV or NASB. And we all are going, okay, this translation does it this way. This translation does it that way. And it's like, okay, that's important. There's a reason why we're all struggling among the translations to find verbiage that describes what the Greek or the Hebrew is describing. So let's just go look at the Greek or the Hebrew itself. So again, like I note here in the green circle, count it all joy differs in the translations. What are some of the differences you see in the translations? And you can lay them out right here. My favorite thing to do is just to type into Google James 1:2 Bible Hub. And when you do that, Bible Hub will immediately at the top of the page just have a bunch of different common Bible translations of that verse lined up, and you can kind of see them and write down the differences right here. So pause this video here and do that. Now, count it all joy in the Greek really reads, consider it pasan joy. And this word can be translated a few different ways. So I think it's most helpful for us to, and you can type this into Google, look up Strong's 3956, or you can type in Greek 3956. How else has this word been translated? How else could this word be translated? And that really helps us understand why translations have translated in different ways and better understand what he's calling us to when we think about considering trials joy. I see, as I'm looking at it, the definition is all or every, and the usage can be all, the whole, every kind of. So now let's read it in light of that. Consider it all, or consider it every joy. Consider it every kind of joy. my brothers. Consider every kind of joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Consider the whole of joy, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. Now, what does the word joy mean here? What does it truly mean to find a delight in trials? And you'll see in the orange circle here, I give you the Strong's number again, Strong's 54. 79 meaning Quran. Whenever I'm like, read it, I'm like, that's Quran. I'm like, wait, is it though? It's been a while since I've taken a Greek class. Okay. Yeah, joy, delight, gladness, a source of joy. And what I'm doing here, let me just show y'all. On my computer, all I'm doing here is I'm on Bible Hub, and I like to look at the definition and the usage. And then if I really want to do a really close word study, I'll go over here and I'll look at the other ways that this word is used in the book by this author. But that's for extra bonus points. If anybody does end up doing that, let me know in the comments where else you find in the book of James this word joy is used, because I would be really curious to hear that. I have not done that myself yet. That would be really interesting to see where else joy, Quran, is used in the book of James, and if it's always translated as joy or if it is translated in multiple different ways, etc. So count it all gladness, a source of joy, delight, my brothers, when you meet trials of various kinds. And if you didn't catch on to it yet, we're on step number 3, where we're doing word studies, where we're looking phrase by phrase through our verse. This is some of my favorite part of verse mapping. I think many of y'all's, but I did want to note that in case you're like, what are we doing here? Okay, so count it all joy, my brothers. Notice how he calls them brothers. Notice how that is like kind of so important that James calls us brothers. Because if we're James' brothers, we are adopted into the family of the faith. This is an equal playing field. He doesn't elect himself higher than everybody else as the half-brother of Jesus Christ. It's really theologically rich to think about it. Anyway, brothers, that's Strong's Greek 80. Adelphoi, a brother, a member of the same religious community, especially a fellow Christian. So really cool that he's calling us brothers, calling us as part of the family of the faith, his family. Write that down here in the pink circle, and then also note there's an additional little bit of a trail I want us to go on off of that word. It says, why might it be significant that James called the church brothers? Also reflect on this brotherhood spanning through time and space, through generations of believers. If we are brothers and sisters in the faith, truly united by the blood of Jesus Christ as family, as adopted brothers and sisters into the faith, then who else are we brothers and sisters with? And how does that change the way we view our lives or the significance of our lives? How does that give us boldness in the face of troubles? To think that I'm sisters with Corrie ten Boom, to think I'm sisters with even Mother Teresa. How does that transform our understanding of even our own lives and the significance of our lives lived if we were brothers and sisters with James? All right, moving on. When you meet trials of various kinds, so consider it joy, my brothers, when you meet trials. Trials? Are you sure, James? Did we translate that right? Truly trials? We're supposed to consider those joys? It is Strong's Greek 3986. Pyrasmos, which the original Greek word, the core of it is pyrasmos. An experiment, a trial, a temptation. Consider the temptations, consider the trials, consider the experiments. I don't love that verbiage. That's all the definition, but the usage is trial, probation, testing, being tried, temptation, calamity, affliction. Most likely what James had in mind here would probably be calamity and affliction. Consider calamity and affliction of various kinds a joy. Now, I also put in here really teeny tiny the other times Jesus himself uses this word, because I did go on a little bit of rabbit trail. I found it interesting where Jesus uses this exact same word. So you'll note those in Matthew 6:13 and Mark 14:38. Go ahead and pause the video here and look those up. And I do have a following rabbit trail that I want us to go down. Why should we consider the joy in the trials? How can we challenge ourselves to seek joy in our trials? Who can we rely on? And here's really the application of our whole study that we've done today, is what does it truly mean for us today in this moment, in this hour, to consider it joy in our various trials, to take joy in the trials. And if you need a little bit more oomph for application into your own life, we do have this orange bubble right here that gives us multiple different references for further study of having joy in trials, even just to follow the theme throughout the New Testament. Here, James, and really the Lord, through James, encourages us to find joy in the midst of these trials because they are creating within us perseverance, steadfastness, and it's all into the glory of the Lord, all for the service of the kingdom and the gospel being spread through the nations. And that really truly not only gives me more endurance, but it also gives me hope in the midst of these trials, that it doesn't end here with my story, my life, my sorrows, but this is all part of something so much bigger than myself. So friends, talk to the Lord today. Be real and honest with him. If you have more questions about verse mapping, leave them down in the comments. But if you want to hear more about book mapping, which is mapping a whole book of the Bible and kind of visually seeing it, check out this video here. I did it through Acts. I think you'll find it really interesting. I'll see you guys in that video. Bye guys.